Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Gearity. I'm going to talk to you today about a recent paper that we published in the Sociology of Sport journal. It's got a nice fancy academic title called Intersectionality Microaggressions and Microaffirmations Towards a Cultural Praxis of Sport Coaching. In this presentation, I'll talk about three major terms. Those are intersectionality, microaggressions, and microaffirmations, and then what we're trying to do with this overall piece and how it situates within the literature in sport coaching. So let's talk briefly about the need for this study. The need for this study, in 2012, I did a book review of a really good book, Sociology of Sport Coaching. And this was a pioneering book at the time, and it still is, and we use it for class. But one of the critiques that I made and observations of this text is that it really omits issues of social and cultural identity, such as race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, etc. What we've got in the book, though, is really strong work from strong sociological theorists like Erving Goffman, Michel Foucault, Bourdieu, and others. It's a really nice book. But what we're missing, again, is the interaction of then our cultural praxis, the theorizing and the practice within coach-athlete relationships as it refers to cultural identities. So what I tried to do then in this paper with my co-author Lynette Henderson-Metzger, with Dr. Henderson-Metzger, was to address this gap. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do with this overall paper, and then show again how coach-athlete relationships are always embedded within these social cultural identities. Okay, we know from other fields like psychology and sociology how race, for example, and how the perception of discrimination can lead to negative health effects. We know that LGBT, for example, have higher rates of depression than other populations. And so within all this too, we know that these are real health disparities, but we haven't really explored this much in sport coaching. So if you're wondering what I was holding, there's the actual paper too in Sociology of Sport journal. I always have it handy. Okay, so let's talk about a few of those key concepts like I mentioned. The first one being intersectionality. When we think about intersectionality, it's a way of theorizing that we are always multiple identities. Sometimes some of those identities are more prominent than others. So it came out of the work of Crenshaw, and it was alluded to before her work, but she really popularized it. And when we were thinking about the feminist movement, white was implicit within the feminist movement, and the black feminist movement was kind of excluded. And so Crenshaw's argument was that we are always these overlapping identities. And so she wanted to think about black women's experiences, particularly in the workforce and then in legal considerations. So what she looked at was that black women were perceiving to be discriminated against and losing out on jobs, and the courts ruled against them and saying, oh, no, women now have equal rights. But what Crenshaw's argument was that women may have equal rights, but black women do not. Black women are being discriminated against. And she created and drew upon this term intersectionality. Okay? So again, it's just the notion that we are always overlapping identities. Within the sport literature, we have a little bit of scholarship on intersectionality, but not much, and not much within sport coaching at all. So the next big concept here is microaggressions. Microaggressions comes from clinical psychologist Daryl Wing Sue's work, and microaggressions are a fancy way, right, an academic way of saying kind of negative put-downs that refer to somebody's cultural identity. It started with racial identities, and you guys can read the definition here of microaggressions, but Sue was talking about how racism changed over time in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and what happened was we didn't have explicit racism as much, and it became more implicit, more insidious. And so people kind of joke or say things without being aware of it, or consciously as well too. But it represented a shift in macro or in-your-face racialized discrimination into a more underground way. For me, this makes sense as I relate it to the work of Michel Foucault from the 70s and 80s as well, who looked at how modern-day power changed as opposed to, in Foucault's seminal work in Discipline and Punish, he talked about how the sovereign used to rule over people and literally take them out to the square and rip their arms off and torture them, disembowel them, cut them open, and that was a way of controlling people. Foucault showed how modern day, our current times have changed, and that we don't have a king ruling over people, but we have these other systems from the Industrial Revolution, from efficiency discourses, from the control of time and space and how we move bodies and how we move athletes around in sport. And so now we're seeing a more insidious control of power. So for me, I want to link these two together in this paper and link microaggressions as a modern day form of power. So Sue's work, again, we borrow from here. These are the three types of microaggressions. We have micro-invalidations, micro-assaults, and micro-insults. What scholars have done is started with the racial microaggressions and then extended it again to other areas. So we could talk a micro-assault against a racialized minority. We could also talk about a micro-insult against a person with a sexual minority, or typically LGBTQ individual. And so we want to think about, where do we see these types of microaggressions and these overlaps in sport? So in the sport literature, we've got some position stands and advocacy papers at the top here from Ryba and then Schenke, some stands in sports psychology that says sports psychology should consider the cultural backgrounds of the athletes, the coaches, and their clients. Then we have a few empirical papers. Burzy studied Muslim cricketers, and one of the microaggressions that they experienced, they talked about when they came in with all the other athletes wearing backpacks, they were called, bombers, right? Because it was a way of putting them down and using their ethnic background, their religious background, to slight them, to insult them. Next reference there is Camus, looked at student athletes, particularly African-American student athletes as well. And then we have the myth of the dumb jock, that they only got into school for sport. They weren't real students. All right? And so these types of things happened in the classroom, and that's what Camus discovered studying collegiate athletes. And then we've got another theoretical paper with Waldron who talked about the burden of lesbian athletes having to be lesbian as well as women. And then we can think about the microaggressions there that we kind of know where female athletes get called certain names, or that female athletes in a certain sport must all be lesbian, and these types of things. So again, the result would be that these have real negative effects on people, that they quit, that they experience depression, eating disorders, a variety of different negative mental health concerns, as well as then a decrease possibly on their performance. And again, it's not a simple causal model to say these things exactly cause this. That's not what we're talking about. But there's certainly an influence of these discourses and practices on athletes and coaches. All right? And then again, we see the gap here. Then there's nothing on sport coaching in this regard. And again, that relates to the 2012 critique that I offered earlier that said that there was really nothing about these intersectional identities in sport coaching. And that's what we want to do. So what we did in this paper is we had 3 short personal narratives that come from my experience as a strength coach, a football coach, youth sport coach, and we intentionally draw upon my experiences like ethnography to tell then evocative, creative analytic practices. These are really stories within the paper, so it's not a traditional academic paper, sometimes called a scientific or a realist tale. These are really stories with a thick, rich description followed by some analysis of the everyday lives of the athletes and coaches and the conceptual academic terms. So we'd also take this and we scaffold it, which is a term that we use in education to refer to going from kind of simple to complex and helping learners understand material. So what we did in this paper was 1, 2, 3. The first story in the paper is subtitled "Throw Them Curveballs." It's about race and baseball. The second story is about training the white masculine way, which is about race and gender. And again, you can see then that intersectionality. We start with one identity, race, and now we're going to add in a second, race and gender. Okay? And then for the third one, we talk about the white, hardworking, hegemonic, masculine, heterosexual Christian archetype. Long one, but again, bringing in now sexuality and religion within the context of American football. Okay? And then throughout the stories, as well as the analysis, we talk about some of the negative effects experienced by the athletes as well as the coaches. So in this regard, it's ethnography and it's our interpretation of it. And so we allude to and suggest possible negative effects of athletes. And that's exactly what I think we should be following up with additional research. Some of those negative effects that we identified were that athletes probably felt excluded, degraded. They suffered literally physical injuries because of the overlap in name-calling, these microaggressions, as well as the actual practices of what they were doing, that there was conflict in the coach-athlete relationship. The coaches, likewise, myself included, you feel sometimes exhausted trying to control athletes and say things like this that are pretty negative and invalidating. Coaches experience, they're kind of mean, but they also sometimes feel satisfied in that they're getting athletes to do what they want them to do. They're controlling them through these other rational practices too. Okay, so we got to look at the full paper to get a little bit more on that one.